Welcome to another episode of
Here we
Dan
are
and
again.
Israel doing their thing, talking about their experiences in this zombie land. I'm going to be honest with you, the most pressing thing to discuss, I might as well just go ahead and shoot it out there as kind of our weekend experience. And you and I both went to get suits at Indochino, which actually is a really nice spot. They tailor your suits for you. The gentleman who initially suited me up was great. Even as far as expertise, the gentleman who suited me up this time was wonderful as well. But he was a flaming homosexual and was uh, very adamant about letting us know as much as possible all the time. And he shared that he's from South Korea, right? And while you were getting your suit done, I was getting an earful from this guy who moved to Los Angeles recently. And of course, he's at the underground gay bars and all the gay bars and gay clubs on Hollywood Boulevard, and like all I can essentially say is like, sorry, man, like don't go to those places. Like, okay, like what else do you want me to say? And anyways, it got to the point where obviously these things are extremely casual for him, not only because he is a homosexual, but because he comes from South Korea. So this is kind of just to tell people who are listening, like, look what's going on in the world with the dissipation of values and a destruction of gender, right? And so he wanted to break it down that there's three places to go to in South Korea. First of all, it's very cheap to live there, and you and I know from having conversations with lots of Jews and really just people in general that one of the main places to go is like Thailand, which also again is filled with prostitution, and that's essentially why lonely young men go there. And then you have South Korea, which if you were to stay there for the whole month in a 1-2 bedroom apartment, it's super clean, it only costs you $350 for the month, right? So here in Los Angeles, you're basically paying like $2,500 rent minimum. And anyways, the benefits come with the food, which is all industrialized American food. So America has kind of puts the ideas virtually everywhere. And then you have the mall, which seems to be a staple just about anywhere that you go. Either it's a survival instinct because it's too cold outside or too hot outside, and nobody seems to want to do anything else. And then the third is the spa, right? And hey, I'm a massage therapist, so I'm aware of like the massage therapy world, the Los Angeles lifestyle in this regard. Obviously, there's too many massage parlors in Los Angeles for them to be honest businesses and for all of them to kind of be putting on their door like we are not a prostitution place. And it's mind blowing to me. I had no awareness even uh, when I went into massage therapy school that any of that would be going on. I suppose I was just naive. But to tell you what the South Korean spa looks like, it's basically like the mall. It's like an alternative to the mall, and there's like four different wet stations and three dry stations. And as he was breaking it down, he said that, like, it's a totally chill place. Like, you come with your friends, and by his standard, he's like, oh, basically, I didn't want to go with my guy friend because, we all show up naked. And so if we did show up together, he'd go with his girl, and then I'd go with my girlfriend. But because it's there's no attraction there, so it's cool. And we'll like sit at the bar and we'll just spend the whole day there. People come with their families and they like watch movies there, and everybody's naked. It's totally cool. Actually, wanted to share, I guess a hereditary fact about South Koreans in general. They don't get athlete's foot, and so it's genetic, and there's a lot of BO that goes on there apparently. So nobody wears deodorant, and like this just it. You just go to the day spa and get naked, and sure, like if you get prostitution at these places, like that's fine too, but like, it's totally cool. You just go to hang out. And that was how he talked to me about it. Like it was totally norm, totally cool. And that's one of the three main things to do in South Korea. And not only did it depress me tremendously to hear that, but it was also tremendously annoying to get an earful about somebody's sexual experiences just by having an interaction. Like I don't know why that's become the norm. Like just because you're gay, you got to tell me about your sex life. Like maybe let's not talk about sex life at all. Like you're kind of giving me a suit and I'm striking friendly conversation to be a nice person. And obviously, I think we've all had interactions with gay people that they have no shame and they don't give a shit about how you feel, which is disgusting, and they are disgusting too. This is why we need to come to your bunker, so just so people understand where we are right now. We come to this bunker. That's why there's only one background and one black piece of paper. It's a very small room. This way the gays can't hear us. And we finally get a little bit of peace here, at least here in Los Angeles. So I'm going to go ahead and just pass this over to Strelly so he can take over and fill in his thoughts.
Well, I think to the point of the masses becoming desexualized, I know it's something we've discussed multiple times, but there's two ways to do it. You can either hold people back from having sex, or you can just shower people with abundant, meaningless sex, or just endless nudity to the point where people just become desexualized through hypersexualization. And it seems that in religious societies, they're more prone to desexualizing people through restricting sex. And in secular societies, they desexualize people by overstimulating them with sex that's not real sex, pornography, prostitution, and just encouraging people to be immodest and to dress essentially nakedly in the street. And that's what causes the breakdown, because if men and women are not experiencing healthy sexual attraction, and now suddenly we have the gays, and now there's all of this sexual attraction that's wrong and really just bad for a person. And so now that's an option too. And then ultimately, what you're looking at is people are losing their sex drive in the sense that it needs to be so focused in the right direction. And if men and women really felt their true sex drive, they would be driven to come together at all costs. And because within the sex drive is the drive to procreate and the drive to connect, the drive for intimacy and the union of male and female, which only takes place in commitment and a constant exploration and discovery of that relationship. And when you have casual hookups, you never get to experience the quality of a relationship and the growth that could take place when men and women integrate together on a daily basis and live together and sleep together every night and live under the same roof and have children together. That's unparalleled. That's the kind of growth and connection that needs to happen. And it's not happening either because people are being clamped down sexually by religious institutions, or they're being told to freely express all sorts of degenerate sexuality that's not even real sexuality by the secular institutions. And it's really evil, and it destroys humanity, and it destroys sexuality, and it destroys individuality.
Actually, to completely agree with you and just explain to others who are listening, like, where did this happen? Right. So you're for sure looking at the focal point being the creation of birth control. And the birth control pill essentially started the destruction of mankind, and it has allowed people who have been doing these sort of practices since the beginning of time to not experience, I know they like to label it as a consequence, when ultimately having children is a great blessing, but for the modern term, the consequence of having children.
If you're having sex with the wrong person, then you experience that as a consequence.
Well, actually, in reality, for there to be a child born at all
is a blessing.
It is a blessing, because it shows you that you are partaking of this, and this is probably the only good that could come from such malpractice. So I hate the modern view of children are a burden and they ruin your life and they're bad. And it's wild to me, because it's like, where were you when you were a child? Like, who took care of you? Who made those compromises? people who didn't have the same shitty values that the modern person has now. And that's what's so shocking. It's like they don't even have that awareness. Like, I'm mentally ill, I can't have a child. And that's what we hear on these podcasts. Like, I love the whatever podcast where all these whores come up, and these really cool Christians like rip them apart. It's very satisfying, but it's also very heartbreaking to see the never-ending young harlot re-entering that arena. And one of the most interesting things that we experience on a day-to-day that's even been confirmed on that show is that there are young girls saying that if some guy just wanted to sleep with me with no good intentions, then he's totally fine. But if the intentions are to be married or to have children or to have a relationship with me, ew. And it's like, you're mentally ill, right? That's a really good man. And you think that he's disturbed, right? And they all like to like jump on each other's back, like, yes, you go, queen, like, fill up your body with hella men. And it's like, no, that's not good at all. Like, the prostitution areas all throughout the world have always been dirty with disease and have had the worst upbringings of children and families. And it's so interesting how like these really dumb, delinquent whores are bringing up stats and data like any of that fucking matters at all. It's like, you created the data, you're on Google all day. It's like, what happened to people using logic and their eyes, right? And then it hurts me to even see these things and to have interactions with people that like some arbitrary piece of data that was pulled up from a Google link that was created by like, who knows, within the past week or two, by the way, it's like brand new data as well, is going to be used against you to be like, this is why killing babies is good, because it's actually for your health. And you hear that all the time, and they'll just pull out another piece of paper and tell you the same thing. Who's creating this narrative?
No, I mean, the whole data thing has people trapped in what's considered to be objective research, except there's every reason to believe that this research is not objective and that it's caused and it's made with actually a goal in mind, with confirmation bias to prove a point that they want to prove. And look at the result of all of this data. It makes people believe that the only trustworthy source is the medical institutions and the colleges and their research labs. And what it's turned people into is worshipers of the government, the medical system, and atheists. Well, if all of this data is disconnecting people from God and disconnecting people from their souls and disconnecting people from family, then maybe this data is not the truth. And just because it has a peer-reviewed study from a group of egotistical professors, that doesn't mean shit. And, I think the world would be a lot better off if we stopped worshiping man-made ideologies. And the claim of science is that it's so provable and it's all demonstratable and they have all of their stats lined up and they can provide you with the evidence. But that's not the case. We're just buying these studies that are fed to us with a complete lack of evidence and a complete lack of knowledge. And if you don't buy it, you're considered to be a kook and a maniac and a danger to society.
Well, this is, again, another thing that we're going to have to deal with in the next 10 years, What are all these whores going to be doing in the next 10 years? Our bodies are going to change. A lot of them are going to be in their 50s. A lot of them are not going to be able to have children anymore. What's going to happen to all those men who just took up all that prostitution over the past 10 years because they were so damn lonely and nobody wanted to settle down and have a family? There's consequences there too. I wanted to actually address the removal of the Bible from the 60s, around the same time that there was the creation of the birth control pill. And this is actually where the disassociation of gender comes from. In the Bible, it says what a man is, what a woman is, and what we're supposed to do. Okay? Man was created in order to work and to guard. The woman was created in order to help the man. And their whole service was in order to protect and live in the garden in order to work it. And so we're all working with our different roles and genders. And God says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. When you remove that narrative from the picture, what is a man? What is a woman?
Absolutely.
Who am I? And look what that's causing now.
Well, the removal of the Bible and the claims that modern science is a better information source than the Bible has caused people to believe the agendas being pushed by the modern scientific institutions, which work in tandem with the government to enforce whatever the hell they want on people. And wait a minute, who says that the Bible is not a good source of information? I mean, how about reopen it, look at it, see what it has to say about gender, about men and women, about sickness and health. And that's something to consider too, is that in the Bible you have men living for 900 years at the beginning of time. And you say, oh, well, I thought people used to die at 30 without modern medicine, and the only reason why we're living till 80, 90, 100 is because we have vaccines, right? Turns out that as a man of faith, I know that life and death is determined by God, and sickness and health is determined by God. And if God wants you to live for 900 years, you'll live for 900 years. And if he wants you to live for 9 years, you'll live for 9 years. And all of this falsifying of information and the claims that the only salvation that we have are our own hands and our own minds and our own instruments.
Or the medical institution.
Well, of course, it's not even our own, right? It's
Yeah.
relying on someone else who tells you, yeah, we'll save you. You know, one of the things Tim Waltz, who's running for vice president on Kamala Harris's ticket at the debate, the vice presidential debate with J.D. Vance, he just makes this statement out of nowhere. He's like, in our party, we trust doctors and we trust women. And you're like, what the fuck? Like this guy just said nonsense out of his mouth. I mean, that's a statement of faith, right? It's like about just trusting women and doctors as if they have this implicit godly knowledge that you now have to bend the knee and bow down to people just because they have either a medical degree or a vagina. You know, it's utterly insane for anyone who understands how truth and falsehood should be measured. But that's what they do. They shame you into submission, and they tell you that you can't open your mouth, and that if you dare question a woman or you dare question a doctor, you're now going against the authority.
It's funny that you bring up the whole woman thing, because really the highest sense of freedom that could possibly exist is to force people to be free, right? And it's like this idea of like forced freedom. And it's like that's what men used to do for thousands of years on behalf of women. And now they got weak enough that they opened the doors for women to essentially enslave themselves. And now you're just dealing with this serious issue of women abandoning their role in mankind and men providing for it. So, you know, there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. Just even to mention this election, because of like what's going on in the world, you know, like a lot of us got to survive, like despite all of these views and faith and science, like for me to open my mouth and like jokingly, but also not very jokingly, discuss the gays and the homosexuals and how much of this shit is going on to such a devastating way, I still have to be extremely hush about it. Like maybe I can talk about it on the camera, but I might not be able to talk about it so much in person, because even to mention these things for people to hear them now, like I have created an environment of like-minded people who have freedom of speech. So of course I have the comfort to say whatever I feel like. That's why I'd even say it on camera. But controlling of speech is devastating. You know, it's like there's very few things that you're allowed to talk about. And for those who are partaking of really, really immoral things, all you can essentially do is like sit down and be quiet, or it'll just turn into a hostile interaction. But I genuinely view these people as extremely bad. I would never invite them into my home. I wouldn't want them to be around my families. Even by biblical nature, you know, like a lot of these people should be killed, you know, and it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. It's like, well, like, at what point is this going to change? You know, you have the political agenda being pushed right now that if, like, which side? There's women in the medical society, and you look at Kamala Harris and she avoids every single question that comes her way. And then you look at Trump basically saying that he just wants to do good for the economy. It's like, look, if you put it all aside, I'd rather pick the guy who can answer questions and isn't brain dead and wants to do well for the economy, because she's offering virtually nothing. And to make such a strong claim like, life and death, like, well, the American institution controls who stays alive and who dies all the time. It's like, oh, what exactly happens to all of these homeless people? What happens in the prison system? You're keeping all those criminals alive? Like, there's been so many things in history where, Christians even used their power to steal babies, and, they made up lies about other cultures, very much Jewish cultures in general, that, they were like demon cannibalistic people who would steal children in the middle of the night in order to uh, fuel their Passover. Like, what an absurd narrative. So you can see how powerful these narratives are in order to enslave and kill other people. But for us to say that I want to survive and I want to live and I don't want any of this dirty, disgusting shit around me in this free country is going to be a problem. No, you have to say it even if it's too problematic and the words are too strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And freedom doesn't mean a free for all where you do whatever you want, even if it's destructive and evil. At some point, there are going to be guidelines, and those guidelines are either created by human beings or those guidelines are created by God. And God is the only one who can set things in stone. He's the only one who can define what is right and wrong to the perfect degree. Everything else is just going to be flawed from our perspective. And so, at what point are we all going to submit to God? At what point are we all going to say, okay, well, let's just trace the history here? It's only a couple thousand years of history. Humanity has been relying on this revelation from God for thousands of years. And when we lived by those principles, life was good. And when we stopped living by those,
Great success, by the way.
amazing success. Now, when people look out at history and they're like, oh man, well, look at all this failure. Well, yeah, each and every time you can trace that failure back to people not following the laws of God as they are written in the 5 books of Moses. It's that simple. And the Jewish people are the primary example of the nation that God gave the 5 books of Moses to, saying, follow these laws. And every time the Jews didn't follow it, which was most of the time, they failed and they were exiled. And
Well, they should be the primary example, but right now that's a narrative that's completely covered up. And also, it really hasn't been the case for like 1,500 years of Jewish history, which is devastating. Actually, one of the best examples is essentially the Protestant Christians, right? Mm-hmm. Like the people who built this country, who wrote the Constitution and gave us all of these laws. They actually didn't believe in Christ very much. They were extremely avid learners of the Old Testament. They took all of those laws and they implemented it into all of the laws that apply to today.
They weren't subservient to the Catholic Church.
Not at all. They weren't subservient to the Catholic. Well, they weren't really to anybody except God. That's why they pushed back, and they were revolutionaries. Right? Mm. And people have like no awareness that like Abraham Lincoln, who abolished slavery, was a man who was reading the Old Testament, which is filled with how to deal with slavery. People love to use the Old Testament like, oh my goodness, there's slavery in it. It's so bad. Like, just letting you know, even by those laws, when there were slaves, and there were slaves everywhere, we were treating our slaves better than you're getting treated at your W-2 job. Okay, let's just be entirely clear right now. Your W-2 job versus Jewish slave has zero comparison. A Jewish slave is way better. This is a man who's making sure you have food on your table, that you're safe. He even gives you wife and children and a place to sleep. You never have to worry about virtually anything. And there's an additional commandment for us to provide beyond the rational means. And after the 7 years, he's actually free to go. But if he decides to say, it's not even, I guess it is 7 years because of the...
That's for a Jewish slave.
For a Jewish slave. But in general, if a slave is free to go, he doesn't have to. He can basically say, look, I don't want to leave you. You've given me my wife and my children and everything is good here. Let me stay. And so they mark his ear that this guy's going to be a slave of the family. And that's actually not an issue. Like, how many acid out teenagers who are roaming the streets could be using a job under the house of a good man who's providing for virtually everybody under the laws of God.
And they become part of the family.
Of course they
the whole
do.
Point.
That's really the whole point, is that Abraham Lincoln obviously knew these things, and he wanted to abolish the slavery that people know. Slavery, the Bible is not how slavery has been taking place for thousands of years. Let's make that completely clear.
Exactly. And to this point of slavery in the Bible, let's just first read this verse in Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. Someone who steals a man and sells him, and it's found in his hand, shall be put to death. If you steal a person and sell him, you get put to death. Okay? So that's how slave trade can happen, where you go and kidnap people and sell them as slaves. That's punishable by death. So now understand that in a biblical frame, the only way for slavery to exist is for someone who is not stolen and kidnapped and sold. Okay? That's a very specific scenario of either someone selling themselves as a slave because they have no support system and they have no family, or it's an inherited slave, or it's someone that you buy from means that are moral. But the reality is, if people are practicing slavery through kidnapping people and selling them as slaves, they receive the death penalty. So for all of this idiocy about people calling out the Bible for being immoral on slavery, the Bible acknowledges slavery as a thing. And if people think that that's immoral, that's their opinion. But the reality is, it's not inherently immoral to own a slave in the Torah. And that's just
also, slavery was taking place all the time, so there had to be a response to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people had inherited slaves.
Look at how long slavery had been going on. The Jews themselves were slaves, so it's basically saying that this is something that exists within the world. You have to deal with it in this manner, and people who were able to read from that could easily deduce that the slave system that was taking place during
was immoral. Yeah, during Abraham Lincoln, they were literally in America. They were kidnapping Africans from Africa, and they were being bought and sold, by the way, by their leaders in Africa, bought and sold by the Americans. And so that's clearly an immoral slave trade, right? And so it ultimately boils down to morality and immorality. And as it turns out, it's possible to morally own a slave in the Torah. But the slave trade as a system and human trafficking and all of these things, that's absolute evil.
Extremely perverse and justifiably punishable by death, which really comes back to our other point about, like, at what point are people going to start instituting righteous judgment? Because you see, the prison system, for example, lets murderers go. There's actually been tons of murderers just released recently within Los Angeles because they just can't maintain them anymore. Like, if there was a man who was like convicted of slavery, he would not be killed by the modern court system, right? We'd be spending our taxpayer dollars to feed him and lodge him and keep him alive for an indefinite amount of time. And by the way, based on how good his lawyers are, he might be able to get out early.
And can I just understand here, what in the world is immoral about putting a murderer to death?
No.
You know, like these fuckers, they actually think they're like, oh, you know, who are we to decide? Yeah, not you, idiot, God. And that's the whole point. At what point do people acknowledge that God has been here and God has spoken?
There are going to be people who are going to implement it. God already gave us all of the rules how to do it. Just a matter of righteous men who are willing to step up and speak about it and start sharing that wisdom. Even to move on past slavery, because, you know, can be a very morbid conversation and it's too confusing for people who have never read the Bible, to really talk about, like, what are the other things that the Torah gives to you? Like stealing, you know, like you don't want people stealing from you, right? How about like having even scales all the time? So when you're a salesman or you're a businessman or virtually any type of man, and you have some sort of business trade, you have to have even scales. And that's just a phrase that is going to apply to virtually everything. Don't cheat people. Actually pay people immediately as well, as in you will not let a worker's wage linger overnight until morning. And so that's not something that people can understand either. Like, by the way, like, that's how you should be paying your employees. And maybe we wouldn't need the government to implement this for us if we had honest people, because you see, the government didn't like what you were doing. They took power and control, and now you need a W-2 and you need a K-1 and you need a 401k and you need all these random retarded handcuffs to pay taxes for, because you might not be treating your employee correctly. Like all of these things are devastating.
Same thing with charity, right? The government has taken charity into their own hands as well. And they're always talking about how they're going to be the ones to provide. You know, I think like Kamala Harris is like, yeah, for every kid that's born, we'll give you $5,000. It's like, what are you, mama bear? Like,
But also, what the hell is $5,000? Toilet paper?
not to mention, yeah, exactly. So it's all just a way to, you know, make people so pathetic that they're just waiting for their check from the government. And of course, everyone else has to pay the government in the claims that the government's going to be distributing
But is
things
nobody
correctly.
else experiencing the inflation? Like, what are you supposed to say about the inflation? The same administration that's been with us for the past 4 years would be the one that would continue for the next 4 years if Kamala Harris gets elected. The inflation is so bad, it's hard to live. And look at this sort of misgendered confusion that walks on the street every day and plagues you.
Yeah, that's celebrated
lonely,
by,
by the
that's
way.
celebrated
all these young
by,
people lonely and hurt.
yeah, and all of that is celebrated by her regime as being
Oh, of course.
the goal, and you know, more of that, please. You know, and it's like, oh, it's horrific.
Well, hopefully, bringing awareness to just how dirty and disgusting all of this is might have people not want to partake of it. I highly recommend people watch this film called Flowers of War. They get an idea of what war really looks like when people have zero boundaries and what a communist state looks like. It's a wonderful film for people who don't know what it is. It's Christian Bale, and they even label it in like the description Dark Knight, you know, and he basically plays a mortician who was in Nanking in Japan during the war, and he
In China.
ends up in China, and he ends up at the church to bury the dead priest, but he ends up in this church with a bunch of young virgin choir girls and a bunch of prostitutes. And it's really interesting, and it shows you that the warriors who were fighting against the power were true heroes, and all of that hard work will be useless if we give in to the modern regime. And I think people need to see just how bad war is, and how much it should be avoided at all costs. And ultimately, people are already living like that for free. Like, what do you think it looks like to live as a whore every day? You know, to post your booty hole on the internet, you know, to pretend that you live a fulfilling life because you work for some man or for some woman at a day job until the day that you die, you know, and you're going to be childless in order to achieve that. Like, wow, you know, what an accomplished and great woman you are. You know, nobody's ever going to talk about you because after you die, you have no lineage, you know, and even if it's just for a single generation, it would be worth it. But nobody's thinking like that, obviously. And that's why I've been pushed to make as much of this content as possible. And then again, like, you know, ultimately we keep repeating the same cycle over and over again, which is like, there are going to be men who abstain from all of this sin because ultimately it's sin. And they're going to start following and teaching the laws of the Bible because that has been lost. And that creates a society that has flourished time and time again for virtually every single period of peace. So if you want a period of peace, this is the sort of work that you're going to have to be doing. You're not going to have to be paying your taxes necessarily or worrying about some text from some bozo. You're probably going to have to abstain from a lot of immoral sexual practices. And you're going to probably have to abstain from so much media. You're also going to have to start reading the Bible, and not only reading it, but teaching it to your children. And, you know, we could go on about all the tactical laws that are in there that add benefit to your life. It's actually been eternal as far as antiquity has been around. It's the oldest literature to ever exist, and everything is built on top of it, which is what makes it impossible for us to start at the bottom, you know. And I highly recommend don't do that.
And it comes back to people viewing good things as bad things, viewing babies as bad, viewing marriage as bad, viewing the Bible as bad, you know. And of course, these things have been misrepresented and they've been practiced incorrectly. But there is a right way to have children, and there is a right way to be married, and there is a right way to practice God's laws that are independent of the manipulative, lying, scum institutions that have capitalized on biology, nature, spirituality, and divine revelation to control people. No, you need to establish a personal relationship with these things and come to understand, as you referenced even the Protestant movement being a movement of protest and revolution, to say we don't need the religious institution to tell us how to worship God, because we are human beings and we are free and we have access to God's word. That's a very good way to move forward. And even in the Jewish community, you have
the key word there is revolt. So like ultimately everybody needs to revolt against the current way of living right now in order to get there, because the current way of living is not only repulsive, but it's empowering individuals to destroy themselves and destroy others.
Yeah, correct. And, I was going to say that even in the Jewish community, you have examples of Jews who were righteous. And something we've been talking about recently is the group of the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim, who were around during the times of the Pharisees and the times of Jesus. And they were essentially the alternative to Christianity and Orthodox Judaism, was Jews who believed only in the 5 books of Moses and the written word of God. And, that's become like a slur. If you're talking to a Orthodox Jew, they're like, oh, you're just a tzadduki. It's like, oh, and is that a bad thing? Is that a bad thing to only believe in the word of God? As if that's not an important perspective to be put forward. What would Judaism look like if we were just following the word of God? I mean, that's a revolutionary idea. That's basically something that's never happened, and that definitely needs to be brought back into the mainstream.
Well, I think it's happened. I think it happened before that term was created, for the 1,500 years, almost 2,000 years of Jewish history that preceded Christ and the revolution of the Sadducee, the Pharisee, the Essene,
For sure.
the Christian, the 10 different Christian sects, the wars that were between them, the establishing of rabbinical authority after all of that nonsense was done, and then the separation of the Sadducee and the Pharisee by the hand of the Pharisee, by the way, which basically played out in many different variations over the course of the past 1,500 years, and has ended up here as Jewish people, with years and years and years of mystical writings of evil men, unfortunately, really the truth, and they themselves, they label each other as, this rabbi was invalid, that rabbi was invalid, he was a sinner, everything that this guy stands for is disgusting. Yet for some reason, we're going to follow this line of people who hated each other and disagreed with each other until the day of their death, and spent every single day combating that idea. It's been heartbreaking to read about the reality of Jewish history and just how far we have diluted the word of the Torah.
Correct. And, I think it's obvious that was the understanding of the Torah. It has always been the 5 books of Moses prior to this split of the rabbis. What I mean, though, is that it wasn't observed because the Jews were just worshiping idols.
That's another thing that constantly
they
exists.
They were following other gods,
Yeah.
And so, what happened with the Pharisees is they said, we won't worship other gods, we'll just worship men. And so not sure that's much better.
They just keep doing the same thing, but they're rationalizing it with their own literature. I mean, that's what happened. I find the craziest story for who's the famous Jewish Messiah. I always forget his damn name. Shabtai Tzvi. There you go. So Shabtai Tzvi and his puppeteer Nathan, who was a follower of Lutheran literature, which
not Lutheran,
not Lutheran. Excuse me.
That's Martin Luther. He's the Protestant guy.
Of Lurianism, right? So this is from a rabbi called
Isaac Luria.
Isaac Luria, and
the Arizal.
The Arizal, exactly. And he, by the way, never wrote any of the literature. So there's a great rabbi, just to break it down for whoever's listening. There's a great rabbi. He didn't write anything. his disciples wrote a bunch of nonsense. It became its own religion. Then they took that religion and they got a massive gathering of people who completely abandoned the Torah and just followed that nonsense. And then a couple generations down, there was a brilliant student of that discipline, and he manipulated a man who already believed that he was the Messiah because he was crazy, and he actually turned him into the Messiah. And then once he became the Messiah, that became the largest Jewish movement that essentially happened for all of those 1,500 years of rabbinic history. It's crazy how it's like the biggest uprising of Jews coming together and selling their homes and thinking that they're going to go on a pilgrimage and do all of this nonsense, when ultimately, not even really towards the end of his days, like, maybe like 5 years, 10 years down his career, after he did a lot of bizarre sexual malpractice and rituals that have nothing to do with the Torah, to conform to Islam and to Christianity and to be fully converted by the other forces. And so once he became a complete fraud, he was still brought back, because the whole idea is that he exists on your blind faith. So for him to not perform miracles is in line with the messianic message. That is insane. It's basically saying, like, for those who don't think, this is what's going to power the great rocket ship that brings us to Hashem.
Yeah. No, I mean, don't forget.
What a nonsense.
Don't
What
forget
a nonsense.
the
By the way,
Orthodox-
they sit in tents. What do they say? Oh, it's so nice, so smooth. And they just hypnotize you with their rabbinic voice talking about nonsense. And all these guys are idiots because their head's been filled with air.
Don't
Since
forget
they were little boys.
that on the basis of an obscure Rashi in the Talmud, Orthodox Jews are waiting for the third temple to fall out of the sky.
Oh,
Okay.
of course.
So
why not?
We're talking about people who have been brainwashed to believe anything as long as it's coming out of the mouth of Rebbe, right? And the Rebbe is a fucking liar very, very often. And, that's the whole thing, is like, you have a damn title, so now blind faith. Hey, blind faith is reserved for God himself and literally no one else. The only reason why you would do something on blind faith is because God told you to do that directly. Other than that, there is never a time where you act on blind faith. And even God will provide you reasoning. Even God makes sure to tell you, I'm doing these things for your own good. These are the commandments and the ordinances that will help guide your life on a good path. It's not just some mindless pursuit of things that are obviously hurting you, right? Like, it's literally masochism, where these people are causing themselves harm just to follow through with the word of a rabbi.
Look where we're seeing it today. Look at how our life changed because we were being honest with what we saw. This same structure where there's a great rabbi who didn't write anything, and then his student took him as an idea and wrote 30 books about him, and then it became a movement where a bunch of people lost their minds and started worshiping a dead rabbi. That is the exact same formula that's going on with Rabbi Nachman, where all of these terrible idol worshipers leave their families behind on holiday in order to fly to Uman, in order to get judgment, or I want to say Rabbi Nachman to them is their lawyer on the day of judgment, which, by the way, doesn't exist. There is no day of judgment by God's Torah, which is also somehow the Jewish New Year in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month.
When it's not the New Year.
When it's not that, because it's in the 7th month.
And it's not even called the New Year in the Torah.
It's at the very least.
It's called the Day of Remembrance.
And exactly, it's called the Day of Remembrance. But you see, these terms have been ingrained in people's heads where they actually can't unhear the Jewish New Year. They can't unpractice it. They have so much guilt from thousands of years of malpractice.
Do you know how Rabbi Nachman saves you from hell?
I'm sure it's just as absurd.
Pulls you out by your payas.
Oh.
So that's why they grow out the long Jewish side curls.
Why? So
he's going to pull you out of hell by your payas.
I mean, can you believe that an entire group of people want to, is there a word for like making yourself part of a cult, like cultify? Like essentially like cultify yourself in order to have Rabbi Nachman pull you out of hell. First of all, what the hell are you doing in hell? That's the first thing, right? Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, they make a huge movement about everything. They just act like little demons doing whatever the hell they want all day. And anyways, you shave everything but your head. From the laws of the Torah, it says, do not round your head and do not even destroy the edges of your beard. So for us to be having fade cuts, we don't do that. We can shave our beards with, the trimmers and stuff like that, the very close one, but not with a blade. But these guys shave everything. They only leave the payot, right? And so you guys are actually going against biblical law in order to fill Rabbi Nachman, tear you out of hell with his great power.
The Jewish skinheads. Yeah. Well, I mean, take even the story of Jesus is the same thing, right? Oh, we don't know anything that he said.
The Jewish skinheads, I like that.
Well, yeah, that was yours. But, right? Oh, we don't know anything Jesus said because everything was written by his disciples, but yet everything he said is so amazing. It's like, if you don't even know what this guy said, then he basically never existed, right? And like the whole thing is crazy. It's a bunch of...
You and I see the same issue in Rabbi Nachman. And I mean, if you just keep going back, you get really Christ and you get what Paul did with Christ. You see, I can't really speak on behalf of what happened to Christ. The only thing that's way more significant about Christ than any of these other messiahs is that God actually gave the Old Testament to the entire world, which essentially is what happened when the Christian faith evolved. I mean, they started studying and learning Jewish law all day long, and it eventually ended up in this culmination of this amazing state that had so much peace for so many years. And I'm a huge fan of that, like despite how Christians, as long as they're not, or actually, as long as they understand the difference between their Messiah, or I would rather label him as a prophet, but the Messiah and the Father, right? There's many Christians who understand that relationship, and they're really just followers of the way, and the way is the Torah, and we minister it and we follow. Like we're going to be cleaning the temple. It doesn't really make sense that Christians would be coming and cleaning our temple, because we're the ministers of the nations. We're supposed to have this tiny little piece of land, and maybe you guys should be helping us and maintaining us, because even your Messiah, he came from our land. He was Jesus of Nazareth. He was a Jew. Everything that happened in that story, you can come see and bring it to real life in Israel. And the same with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's no Christ without Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Jews and Christians can be in line. Even Muslims, for that matter, they don't really like Christ, right?
Well, they don't believe he's God.
No, they don't believe he's God. So there you go. So see, we have agreements with the Muslims. The Christians have agreements with the Jews. We can make this work. We can really make it work.
Well, that would really be the only hope. And there is a kinship that's shared by people of the book and people of faith who actually know and acknowledge this history and this legacy for being real and for being an actual representation of how history has evolved and how faith has been developed and who God is. And if we were all honest with each other as to what is the foundation and what is the source, well, then we'd actually be able to come upon a common ground. And I think that is possible. I think it is.
I think it's about time I do a mention of this. I did write a book called The Children of Israel, and I basically only wrote the introduction. Actually, not basically. All I did was write the introduction, and everything just quotes the Torah and all of the laws, so that if one wanted to know all of the laws of the 5 books, this is just a guide pamphlet on how to find it in the Bible. And it's been useful for me at the very least. So I'm very happy I created it simply just for myself. But for those who don't know what the laws are, and they're all in the 5 books, you could use this to look at the category and then bring it back to you. And so I actually wanted to bring it out simply so I could read a couple of the tactical laws back to back, so people understand that the laws of the Torah create the world that you want to live in. And I think maybe a good...
Well, I could just say the introduction is brilliant. And
thank you.
The way that you categorize the commandments, make them very accessible. And it's a great reference point for anyone who wants to find the sources for the commandments and even just to read them straight.
For sure. I mean, you could read all the commandments that don't include laws of the Levites, the Kohens, or the building or the maintenance of the temple, which is basically all the practical laws. They're all in here. I spent
a lot of time trying to put it together, and I did, and it's on Amazon as well. And I just wanted to read, I think, a very wonderful paragraph, I guess, called Laws of Human Treatment. Because this kind of allows people to see that, like, this is day-to-day stuff. How you're going to treat your neighbor, how you're going to treat your mom, your aunt, your father, your mother, everybody that you love, or even people that you don't love. So Exodus Mishpatim 23:7. Do not execute the innocent or the righteous, for I will not exonerate the wicked. Exodus Mishpatim 23:9. Do not oppress a stranger. You know the feeling of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Leviticus Kedoshim 19:11. And you shall not lie to one another. Leviticus Kedoshim 19:14. You shall not curse the deaf, and you shall not place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am Hashem. And I'm just going to stop quoting from where it's from. I'm just going to read the commandments. You shall not commit a perversion of justice. You shall not favor the poor, and you shall not honor the great. With righteousness shall you judge your fellow. You shall not be a gossip monger among your people. You shall not stand aside while your fellow's blood is shed. I am Hashem. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall reprove your fellow, and do not bear a sin because of him. You shall not take revenge, and you shall not bear a grudge against the members of your people. You shall love your fellow as yourself. You shall not make a cut in your flesh. A tattoo shall not be placed upon yourselves. I am Hashem. In the presence of an old person you shall rise, and you shall honor the presence of a sage, and you shall revere your God. I am Hashem. You shall not taunt or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not cause pain to any orphan or widow. If you dare to cause him pain, for he shall cry out to me, I shall surely hear his outcry, my wrath shall blaze, and I shall kill you by the sword, and your wives will be widows, and your children orphans. And a prince amongst your people you shall not curse. If you encounter an ox of your enemy or your donkey wandering, you shall return it to him repeatedly. If you see the donkey of someone you hate crouching under its burden, would you return from helping him? You shall help him repeatedly. Each of you shall not aggrieve his fellow, and you shall fear your God, for I am Hashem, your God. You shall not see the donkey of your brother or his ox failing on the road and hide yourself from him. You shall surely stand them up. One shall not take a lower or upper millstone as a pledge, for he would be taking a life as a pledge.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and again, it extends to converts. It extends to laws of animal treatment. There's a couple small variations there. There's laws of justice, right? There's the 10 Commandments. I mean, there's not that many categories. It's a pretty short book and could help you a lot, but ultimately, reading the 5 books is obviously the way to start. If you're not willing to go there, or maybe you've already been there and you're too confused from rabbinic literature, this could be very helpful for you.
oh, it's a great guide to the 5 books of Moses. And yeah, so everyone buy the Children of Israel. And once we're doing this, might as well share with you my book. It's called The Promised Land. And it's just an explanation as to what it would take for us to reach the Promised Land. Because even in the history of the Israelites, that's the pinnacle moment. We get out of the desert and we arrive at the Promised Land. And people don't really seem to have an idea of how to get there, but it's very much action-based and faith-based, and it has to do with how we follow God. And so it's 20 short chapters, kind of just meditations and refocusing on putting God first and understanding that it's His laws that we need to follow, and just reorienting your mindset and understanding what it means to be a servant of God.
It's also extremely well written, and probably be a top philosophy book at some point in time. I didn't write a philosophy book, but if you guys are into that, I know you'll be into this. So just want to give it some high praise.
Thank you. Yeah, and again, it's philosophy, spirituality, but ultimately, and I write there, is that my judgment was informed by the 5 books of Moses, and I find that to be amazing, that in the realms of law and philosophy and history and every aspect of life, the 5 books of Moses speaks to conclusively and with clarity. And that's what we're lacking. And that's where we can discover a real understanding of life.
Definitely. And just to possibly end on this note, I don't want to get rid of positive oral tradition, like since we're on the subject of Judaism and the differences between beliefs. Like if it's in support of the 5 books, then in no way would we get rid of it. But in order to achieve what God has wanted from us since the beginning, we actually need to completely abandon all of it and then cherry pick through it as a together nation who's read the 5 books of Moses. Until then, we're going to continue holding on to the past with white fingers, okay, never letting go, and there's never going to be any change. And trust me, I want change for Jewish history because I'm so empathetic and I love them so much, and I love my nation, I love all people in general. And if they don't change, then they're going to experience that same destruction that they have in the past. And that's why I'm talking to both the secular society and caution of war, and I'm talking to my own people, and for the sake of my own concerns.
Yeah, well, and lots of our own people are part of the secular society too. In fact, the majority are. And so that's the point to remember, is that the words that are uncompromising, the law that's unbreakable, is that comes from God, the 5 books of Moses. When it comes to what is after, we can cherry pick wisdom from so many different places, even from other religions, even from other philosophies and all of these things. But, to say that we should go ahead and swallow the pill of oral tradition whole, what you're doing there is taking on thousands of years of endless writings by unimaginable amount of people, and so much nonsense and bad ideas are in there. And so, what you have today with Orthodoxy, because you were mentioning how in the past Orthodoxy was like fighting within itself, but nowadays it's increasingly common to see an Orthodox person who's just like, oh, it's all good, it's all dribbe, and the Hasidim and the this, and they're all just like, they're all together because they just appreciate the fact that they have that commonality. And so to them, they won't even differentiate within their own
Unfortunately.
distinctions.